Hey folks, it's Dr. Gilchrist, and I, as promised, am going to finish up our discussion of development, particularly during adulthood and adolescence. Those should be reversed, obviously. So I'm going to go ahead and share screen. All right, so you should be able to see my notes for developing through the lifespan. We went a little too far here. So I wanted to briefly talk just a little bit more about this moral development that was discussed by Kohlberg. So as we saw with Piaget's stages of cognitive development, Kohlberg very much believed that you went through these sequences of these stages. So convention or pre-conventional morality based on self-interest, so either avoiding punishment or trying to get a reward. Additionally, we have our conventional level, which is about conformity and social order and authority and following rules. And then finally, we have our post-conventional morality, which is based either on a social contract or it's based on one's own individually defined principles that transcend social contract ideas. So one thing that I will kind of mention that your book also mentions too is that this tends to be kind of limited largely to more individualistic cultures, such as in the Western Hemisphere, like the United States. There's this emphasis on personal morality, personal goals, rather than a collectivist culture. And additionally, as I kind of mentioned, it does tend to be a little bit more male focused. And because of that, Carol Gilligan actually talked a little bit about the development of morality in groups of women called In a Different Voice. So now I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about social development during adolescence. So Erik Erikson is a developmental researcher, and he believed that during adolescence, the critical goal is to develop a sense of identity. So Erikson actually has several different stages, each with a major thing that a person ideally should be learning or developing at that particular point. So infancy is the time where infants learn to trust. Toddlerhood is about developing a sense of autonomy, that they can do things on their own without help. The preschool years tend to be marked by initiative, developing that initiative, carrying out plans. Elementary school tends to be for developing confidence. As I've said, adolescence is for developing that identity. Young adulthood is marked by developing closer relationships and developing intimacy. Middle adulthood is marked by generativity, which is about your sense of making a contribution to the world that is greater than yourself. And then late adulthood is kind of a time where you reflect on the back on your life, and you wonder if you've lived your life well. So Erikson had all of these different stages. And so during adolescence, we often will find that we have different selves based on where we are and who we're with. So for example, the self that you might choose to display when you're around your parents is probably going to be pretty different than the sense of self when you're around your friends, and even different types of groups of friends. You might behave differently with your fellow athletes than you would with people in your suite. So you have these different selves. And so that you use in different situations. And so for Erikson, the big goal of adolescence is to take all of these different selves and basically integrate them into a unified whole, a unified sense of self and identity. One of the other major things that we do see tends to shift in adolescence is one's relationship with their parents versus how they are with peers. So one of the things that we do find is that as we begin to develop our own identity, parents tend to have a little less influence than they used to. And peers start to have a greater influence. Now, parents do still kind of play a role for certain things. Generally, we do find, for example, that parents can play a huge role in things like what kind of career a child goes into, what college they potentially pick, but peers are going to have more of an influence for good and for bad. So your book kind of talks about how ostracism and bullying can sometimes lead to a very damaged sense of identity. Conformity and herd mentality in adolescence is also pretty common, and that can potentially prevent you from figuring out who you are. But we do tend to see that as we get older, peers have more of an influence and parents have less. That doesn't mean that parents have none, but the influence does begin to shift as teenagers kind of find their own identity. So your book talks a little bit about a stage that is known as emerging adulthood, and this has been largely proposed for Western culture. So adolescence tends to be that teenage period, and then early adulthood has been kind of characterized as what we call emerging adulthood. The idea is that some of the hallmarks that we typically think of as being marked as adult are typically not ones that are achieved relatively early in adulthood anymore. So we have more people going to college, and obviously college is a wonderful way to open your world, but it does mean that that sense of independence is not fully achieved until one has potentially developed a career, have a family, and things like that. So one of the things that we do find, for example, is that most young adults in 1960 had financial independence at an earlier age than today's young adults do. Your book notes that in 2016, about 15% of 25 to 35-year-old Americans lived in their parents' home. Now, let's be clear, there's no shame in that. My mother has done that a couple of times. But there's this idea that being truly independent is a marker of adulthood, and we are achieving that later and later because of college, because of student debt, later marriage ages. And this is kind of a culturally based thing, I would actually argue. Do you have to own a home to be considered an adult? Do you have to be married and have children to be considered an adult as well? And so culture absolutely plays a role here. And you can kind of see that in 1890, the average age between when somebody was physically an adult and when they were considered socially an adult through marriage, yeah, you can kind of see marriage doesn't make you an adult. Marriage doesn't make you an adult. Like celebrities get married for like maybe 72 hours, like under certain circumstances. That doesn't necessarily specify grown-up behavior. But we have kind of this 7.2-year period between when one is physically an adult and when they get married. By 1995, that had certainly doubled, and the age of first marriage is getting older and older. Again, I don't think that necessarily says that somebody is not an adult, but based on our traditional markers of adulthood, those may be considered by some to have not been achieved yet. You can tell I have a lot of thoughts on this. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about some of the physical changes in adulthood. Once you are kind of past emerging adulthood, young adulthood, it's very, very difficult to define the stages because there's going to be a lot of variability across age groups and even within age groups. So it becomes very difficult to talk about the different cognitive stages, or if there are any stages, once you get into middle and older adulthood. We do know that physical abilities for the most part and performance does tend to peak by mid-20s. That is even true true for very well-known athletes who are still playing in their 40s. They are still going to have issues with, they're still going to probably, so for example, somebody who is a marathon runner in their 40s is probably not necessarily going to be as fast as they were in their 30s. Now, that marathon runner is still going to be faster than me, but they're going to be slower than they used to be, is what I'm kind of getting at here. So here's kind of an example. So here we have Willie Mays, one of the greatest baseball players of all time. And you can kind of see the years that he played. And even though he was very, very good, here's Willie Mays, you can kind of see that he peaked very quickly within 5 and 10 years of playing and then leveled off. And you actually kind of see the same case of standard baseball players with 20-year careers. Just because one is an exceptional baseball player does not mean they are still not subject to changes with age. We do know that at around age 50, so middle adulthood is kind of considered around age 40 to age 50. Around age 50, we do see menopause beginning in many women, which is basically a reduction in the production of estrogen and a loss of fertility. And we do also see a decreased level of hormones and fertility in men. The difference is that for men, testosterone kind of drops steadily throughout life and gradually. For women, estrogen is produced until menopause, and then it just kind of plummets. So I want to briefly talk a little bit about older age. So one of the things that we do know physically is that we do find that muscle strength, reaction time, and stamina does tend to decrease with age, particularly after age 70 or so. So you can kind of see here, we have vision, identifying letters in an eye chart. There's a huge drop off at 70. Here we have identifying smells. And then we also have identifying spoken words. So our senses do tend to decline a bit in our 70s, as does our muscle strength, our reaction time, and our endurance. It's part of the reason why it's really important to get into weight training as you get older, because that can kind of help. Obviously, it won't necessarily prevent these things from happening, but it can make them less debilitating. If we talk about aging and intelligence, we do know that while memory performance does get worse with age, we do actually tend to find that knowledge of trivia and the world, what we call crystallized intelligence, actually increases with age. So what you're looking at here are a variety of different cognitive tasks, and you can see that those tend to decline pretty steadily throughout life. Usually starting by the mid-20s. So once your frontal lobe is done developing, it's all kind of downhill from there. But what you do see is that while most things do decline with age, various types of memory tasks, working memory tasks, processing speed tasks, things like vocabulary actually do tend to increase with age. The older that you get, the more knowledge about the world that you have. And so hopefully by the time you're older, you will be much, much better at things like Jeopardy than you are right now. So very, very briefly, I do want to talk about this notion of a midlife crisis. So odds are pretty good. You've probably heard more about the quarter life crisis, which tends to happen in your 20s. You start to wonder if you're doing what you want for your life or if you're just doing what your parents wanted for you. But before that, we had the midlife crisis, which is basically the idea you realize half of your life is now over. And so you want to try to figure out if you're doing what you believe your purpose is. So what you're looking at here is a measure of emotional instability. The idea here is that if you are having a midlife crisis, you're going to become a lot more anxious or a lot more worried and might have some death anxiety, and you're just trying to do things to feel alive. And it really turns out that this emotional instability doesn't really change throughout life. Now, we do know that people that identify as female often do tend to have more neuroticism than people that identify as men. Some of that could be a social issue or a socialization issue, but in general, there is no evidence for there being something called a midlife crisis. So, folks, this is pretty much all that I had. I will be uploading readings for chapter 3. They are from the previous edition of the book, but there's not too much difference between them. So most of the major points will be covered. But that's pretty much all I had. If you have any questions, let me know. And I will see you tomorrow night for the review session. Bye.